Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we are going to be creating reward chests that you can step on, be rewarded for, and then it also displays a cooldown once you collect the rewards as well. As always, if you guys do enjoy the video or it does help you out, make sure you smash the like button, also hit the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on if you want to get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Of course, I have a Patreon if you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I make during this video. There's a link down below in the description, and you guys can go and check that out. With that all being said, let's hop right into it. And the first thing that we're going to do in this episode is make sure that we have all of our chests set up correctly. How our game is currently set up is there's no actual group chest or anything like that at the very beginning, but currently on two of our islands we actually have some chests that players can go up to and redeem for some rewards. Now we actually set these chests up a couple of episodes ago when we set up all of our islands and everything else like that. The chest actually comes from a free resource pack that all of you guys have access to. There's a link down below in the description and you guys can go and get it from there. Another thing that we should look at is actually how the chests are set up. So we're going to go inside of the island folder, and then currently in the forest and the Arctic island is where we actually have chests. So inside both of these folders we have a model called chest. Now if we open up that model, we can see it has a couple of children. The only really important one is the child called Hitbox, because we're actually going to be using this specific part to determine whenever a player touches or gets near a chest and when we should reward them. Other than that, as long as you have your chest set up similar to mine, you should be all good. Now, the way that we usually handle things like this is we would actually create a config module that holds the name of all the different chests and the rewards and everything else like that. In this episode, though, we're actually going to be kind of setting up our configuration a little bit differently. So rather than having all of our config variables about each of the individual chests inside of a module script, we're actually going to put that information directly on each of the individual chest models. So what I mean by this is go ahead and select your chest model. Then what you can do is you can scroll all the way down and you're actually going to see attributes. Basically, every single instance, which if you guys aren't familiar with an instance, it's literally every single object that you can add inside of your Explorer. You're able to add an attribute to every single instance in Roblox. So this folder can have attributes and this model can have attributes and every other thing can have attributes added to it as well. Now, another thing that we might want to consider is what attributes do individual chests need. For instance, if we were to create a config module like we have done in the past, what properties would every single chest actually need? Well, based on the way that Clicker Simulator actually has their game set up, each of the chests seem to have a different cooldown. So we're going to want to store a cooldown on each of the individual chests to say how long we want the player to have to wait before the player is able to be rewarded again. Additionally, each chest usually rewards a different currency. So for instance, one chest could reward clicks, another one could reward gems, and another one could even reward rebirths as well. Now, along with that specific reward, we also need to know how much of that specific reward we want to actually give to the player. So do we want to give them 100 clicks? Do we want to give them 1,000 gems? Or do we want to give them 10,000 rebirths, for example? So that's what we're going to be using the attributes for. So first things first, we're going to go inside of the forest folder, select the chest inside of here, and then we're going to start adding attributes to this. Now for the first attribute, the name is going to be cooldown, and the type is actually going to be a number. And keep in mind the casing that you use when you're actually creating the name for this attribute. So if you use lowercase, you're going to want to make sure that you keep that in your mind, because when we go to script this, we're going to need to make sure that we use lowercase for this as well. Now once we have that all typed out, we can go ahead and click save, and we can see that this attribute has been added with a default value of 0, which we can actually modify to set the cooldown for the specific chest. Now for this specific chest, we want to actually set the cooldown to be 10 minutes. But instead of setting it to 10, we're actually going to set it to 600, because 600 is the amount of seconds in 10 minutes. So the cooldown here is going to be in seconds rather than minutes. So now this chest is going to have a cooldown for 10 minutes. Then we're going to add another attribute, and this attribute is going to be a string with the name of currency. Now for the value of this attribute, we want to set this either to clicks, gems, or rebirths, as those are the three currencies in our game. Now for this chest, we're actually going to reward clicks, so we're going to say clicks with a capital C, just like that. Then finally, we're going to add one more attribute. This attribute is going to be called reward, and this is going to have a number inside of it. And now for this attribute, we want to say how many clicks or how much of the currency we want to actually reward to the player. So for instance, we're just going to say 1,000, so whenever a player redeems this chest, they're going to get 1,000 clicks. Okay, so now that we have that one chest set up, let's go ahead and set up the one inside of Arctic as well. So we're going to go ahead and add a brand new attribute. First, we're going to make sure that it's a number, and we're going to say cooldown. For this one, we're going to set it to 1,200 seconds, so that's a 20-minute cooldown instead of a 10. Then we're going to add another attribute. This one is going to be called currency. For this currency, we're going to say gems, and then we're also going to add one more attribute, which is going to be a number, and that's going to be reward, just like that. Now, how many gems do we want to actually reward to the player? Let's go ahead and say 10,000, just like that. Okay, so now that we actually have the configuration for both of these chests set up, we're good with that. What we can then actually start doing is creating the GUI for each of these chests. So what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the starter GUI. We're going to add a brand new screen GUI to this. We'll rename this to chests. Then for the properties, we want to set reset on spawn to false. Inside of the screen GUI, we want to add a billboard GUI. And then we're going to rename this to template. Now for the properties inside of here, we want to make sure that we set reset on spawn to false. Then what we could do is we can actually set the Adorny property to the specific model so that we can start seeing our GUI. So what we're going to do is go back inside of our workspace. We're going to click on forest, and then we can see that we have this chest chest selector right here. So now what we can do, go down to the template, select the Adorny property, scroll all the way back up here, and then click on chest, just like that. Now we can't exactly see the GUI yet, so what we're going to do is we're just going to throw a text label inside of here, and now we can actually see the GUI, so we can see sort of what it looks like and how it's positioned and everything else like that. What we're then going to do is for the text label, let's just real quickly set the size to 1, 0, 1, 0, so it's scaled rather than being the offset. Then going back to the billboard GUI, we can actually adjust the size of this billboard GUI as well. So of course we want to make that scaled, so we're going to say 1, 0, 1, 0, and it's really hard to see, but it created a very, very small square right there. Now we definitely want to increase the size, so for the X scaled, we're going to try 15, and for the Y scaled, we're going to try 5, and I think that looks pretty good. What we of course then want to do is move it above the actual chest so that we can see it, and how we're going to do that is by adjusting the studs offset. So we could try to set the Y to 5, and we can see that it appears a little bit above the chest, but it's still kind of blocking the chest itself. We could then try 10, and I think that actually looks good. This time it's floating above the chest, and it's no longer covering the chest, so I think that's pretty nice. Then if we look at the light influence property, if we set this to 0, the GUI is no longer influenced by light, and it'll just be its normal bright white color or whatever color that you actually make it. So I think we're going to do that because that looks a lot better. And then we can also modify the max distance property as well. So currently it's infinite. So if we like literally go to our spawn and look up, we won't see it here, but like if we could get a good angle on it from like far away or something like that, you will still see it. So it's really hard to actually see it right there, but you are able to see it, and that looks pretty weird, so we don't want that. So in Studio, you can pretty much move the camera around, and now we can play with the max distance. So for instance, let's set this to 100, and now we have to move a little bit forward, and now we can see that this is when it appears based on how close we are when it's set to 100. So do we want to increase this so that a player up on that cloud could see it? That really all depends on what you guys actually want to do. I'm going to leave it at max distance 100 because I just want it to be visible if the player is on the island, and that's exactly how this is working, so I'm fine with that. Now with all that being said, we're pretty much done with modifying the billboard GUI properties, and now we're going to start working on the text label. So for this text label, we actually want to adjust the size. So rather than being 1 on both the X and the Y scale, we actually want to set the Y scale to be 0.5 because we want this text label to be half of the actual height of the parent. The reason for that is because we're actually going to have 2 text labels, and we want them to be the same height, the same length, and everything like that. So that's why we're doing 0.5 so that both of them can take up half of the GUI. Anyways, what we're then going to do is rename this text label to title. Then we can modify the text and set this to clicks chest just so that we can visually see this. For the text color, we're going to go ahead and set that to white. Let's also set the background transparency to 1. For the font, we're of course going to set that to Gotham, and I think we're going to make that bold as well. For the text scale, we're going to set that to true. For the text stroke transparency, we're probably going to set it to about 0.5-ish. It really depends on how much stroke you want to be visible, but I think that looks pretty nice. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to actually add a UI list layout to this. So now that we have the UI list layout inside of the billboard GUI, what we're then going to do is duplicate the title and rename the second one to subtitle, just like that. Now, for the text of the subtitle, what it's going to say is ready to collect, exclamation mark. Now, those text labels look pretty good. What we might want to do is go into the UI list layout, and for the horizontal alignment, we want to set that to center. For the vertical alignment, we also want to set that to center as well, and then we might want to play with the padding a tiny bit. For instance, if we set the scale to 0.1, we can see there's a little bit of space now in between those 2 text labels. And of course, if you want to, you can add more padding or have less padding so that the text labels are a little bit closer together, but I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so now we're pretty much finished with creating this GUI. What we then want to do is we want to set this billboard GUI to no longer be enabled, and we can also clear the Adorny property of this as well. Next, what we want to do is set up the player data. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the player data folder, and open up the template module script. Then we're going to go inside of the template variable. We're going to add a comma after jumps, and then we're going to say chest, and that's going to be equal to a table, just like that. The reason that we create any player data is so that we can track each individual player's cooldown for when they first open the chest, and then when they're allowed to open the chest again as well. Next, we'll actually start scripting the GUI. So we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of the GUI folder, and add a brand new local script to this as well. Then we're going to rename the local script to chests, and then I'm going to go into the portals local script that we have right here and just grab most of the common variables that we use all of the time anyway. So I'm going to grab all of these and paste them directly into the chest local script just like that. Now inside of here, we don't actually need the format number or the island config, but we'll be using mostly the rest of these variables. So first things first, we have the GUI variable right here, and that's actually set to the portals. Instead of the portals, we want to set that to the chest, just like that. Then the template variable is actually correct, so the template is going to be GUI.template, just like that. Next, what we want to do is we want to start creating a couple of static variables. The reason that we're creating a couple of static variables is because most of the chests always say something similar for both the title and the subtitle. So the first variable that we're going to create is called unclaimed_title, and that's going to be equal to a string which says currency in all capital space chest, just like that. The reason that we're creating that variable is because when a chest has not been claimed by a player yet, what the title is supposed to say is something like clicks, gems, or rebirth chest. So the chest will basically display what currency it contains. Then for the next variable, we're actually going to say claimed_title, and that's going to be equal to another string. And now when a player player has claimed the chest and it's now on cooldown, we actually want the title to display come back in semicolon just like that. Then the final static variable that we're going to create is called unclaimed underscore subtitle, and that's going to be equal to a string which says ready to collect exclamation mark just like that. Now if you're confused by any of this, you can go straight into your starter GUI, inside of the chest UI, open up the template, and just look at what the text label says. So for the title text label, it currently says clicks chest, and that's the equivalent of the unclaimed title. So the currency is clicks in this scenario, and then if we look at the subtitle text, we can see that this text says ready to collect. So that's why for unclaimed subtitle, we have ready to collect, because the text of this text label is currently set to what it should look like when it's unclaimed. With all those static variables created, let's go ahead and start creating the function for generating the GUIs. So we're going to say local function generate GUIs. That's going to accept no arguments. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the workspace, inside of the islands folder, and then we want to loop through all of the descendants inside of this specific folder. Now, if you're not sure what a descendant is, first of all, you should know what a child is. So for instance, whenever we call the getChild method on a folder, for example, if we call the getChild method on this islands folder, what the children are going to be are these three children right here. So these three folders. But if we called getDescendants, then what descendants are is every single child inside of this initial folder right here. So for instance, all the children of the Arctic folder are descendants of this specific folder as well. All the children inside of chest, all the children inside of this bottom model are all descendants of this specific folder because they're all children of children inside of this specific folder. So hopefully that explains it and helps you understand what getDescendants are. With that being said, let's go ahead and start scripting with this. So we're going to say for underscore comma descendants in workspace dot islands, and now we're going to call getDescendants just like that. And then we're going to say do, and there we go. Now the reason that we're looping through all of the descendants is because this is basically an easy way to get the chest from every single island which actually has a chest inside of it. So what we're then going to say is if descendant, also descendant should not be plural, so we're going to fix that real quick, and there we go. Then what we want to do is we want to say if descendant dot name does not equal a string, so chest, then continue end. So basically, as we're going through this loop, if the name of the specific thing that we're currently looping through is not chest, then we're just going to keep continuing until we find something called chest. Now, whenever we find something called chest, what we want to do is actually create a GUI for that. So let's actually go ahead and create a function for creating the individual GUIs. So we're going to say local function create GUI, and this is going to accept the chest, which is going to be a model. Now that we have that function, anytime a descendant is actually called chest, we want to call that create GUI function. So we're going to call that function right here, and then we're going to pass through this specific descendant, which is the model named chest. Now we're pretty much done with this generate GUIs function, so we're going to go ahead and start working on the create GUI function. Inside of here, what we want to do is we want to create a variable called clone, and that's going to be equal to the template, and of course we want to clone it. Then we want to set the parent property of the clone to actually be the screen GUI that the template is stored inside of. Then we also want to set the adorning property of the clone, and that's actually going to be set to the chest model, which is passed to this function. And then we also want to set the name property of this as well, and we actually want to rename it to the specific island that this chest is on. Now, how do we actually get the name of the island? Well, the parent of the chest model is actually a folder, and the name of that folder is the name of the specific island. So what we're going to do is we're going to say chest.parent.name just like that. Okay, so now that we have that, what we can actually do is we can call the generate GUIs function below where we created it. And now when the player first joins the game, this generate GUIs function is going to be called. It's going to loop through all the descendants in the islands folder, and it's basically just going to find the ones called chest. Then it's going to call the create GUI for each of those individual chests. When we create the GUI, we're going to clone the original template. We're going to set the parent to the screen GUI that our template's also stored in. Then we're going to set the adorning property so it appears on the specific chest model. And then we're also renaming the GUI to the specific island that the chest is stored inside of. Additionally, we want to make sure that we set the enabled property of that clone to true so that we can actually see it as well. Now, we're actually going to come back to that create GUI function because we have to do one more thing. But before we do that, we're actually going to create another function. And this function is going to be called update GUI. And what that's going to accept is island as a string, just like that. Now, the reason that we're creating this function is because we're actually going to constantly call this function by using a while loop, and this function is actually going to update the cooldown timer to be displayed to the player if the player has a cooldown for the specific chest. So inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to check if the player currently has a cooldown. So we're going to create a variable called player cooldown, and that's going to be equal to the state manager.getData.chests, and now we want to index that chest table with the specific island that the chest is inside of. Then once we do that, we also need to get the GUI that we created above as well. So we're going to say local GUI equals GUI, which is the screen GUI that all of our GUIs are stored inside of, and then we're going to index that with the specific island just like that. Now that we've got the GUI, what we then want to do is we want to check if the player has a cooldown. Now, not all players will have a cooldown. That's why we actually have to check this first. And if the player does have a cooldown, then we want to check if the player's cooldown is greater than os.time time, which is the current time on the client. And if that's true, so if the player has a cooldown and the player's cooldown is greater than the current time, then that means that the player still is on the cooldown, and we want to make sure that we update the GUI to display the time as to when a player can collect this chest once again. So if the specific chest is on cooldown, what we then want to do is we want to say GUI, and then we want to get the title text label, and then we want to set the text of that text label to the claimed_title variable that we created earlier. Now, not only do we want to update the title, but we also want to update the subtitle as well, because in the subtitle is where we're actually going to display how many minutes, hours, and seconds the player has to wait before they're able to redeem the chest again. So we're going to say GUI.subtitle.text, and now we're going to set the text to something, but for right now, we're just going to set it to a blank string. Now, we're actually going to be using a really simple function that was published to the developer forums, and what this function is going to do is it's basically going to accept seconds, and then it's going to convert that amount of seconds into a format for hours, minutes, and seconds, and we're going to use this function to create a nice string to display the cooldown to the actual player. So I'll leave a link down below in the description to this function. Otherwise, you can just follow along and type this out yourself. But what we're going to do is we're going to copy that function, we're going to go back into Studio, and we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the libs folder, and we're going to add a brand new module script to this. We're going to rename that module script to format time, and then we can also rename the module variables inside of here as well. Then with those functions that we copied, we're going to paste them inside of here. Now for the convert to HMS function, we're actually going to say format time dot convert to HMS, and then for this format function, what we're going to do is just paste this above where we create the module variable, and we're going to say local function instead of just function. And now this module is set up, so we just have to require it and use it in our other scripts. So we can go ahead and close out of the format time module, go back to the top of our chest scripts, and this time we have to require it. So we're going to say format time, and that's going to be equal to require replicated storage.libs.format time, just like that. And now that we have that, what we can then do is where we set the text of the subtitle, we're going to go ahead and call format time, convert to HMS, and then we want to pass through the player cooldown and subtract os.time from that. Just like that. Now, inside of the same if statement, we want to say else. So if the player does not have a cooldown, then what do we want to do? Well, we also want to update the text of the title and subtitle as well. So we'll say GUI.title.text, and that's going to be equal to unclaimed title. But if we look at the unclaimed title variable, we actually have to replace the word currency right here. Now, if we remember, how do we actually get the currency of each individual chest? Well, each individual chest has an attribute set on that chest with the specific currency that it's meant to reward. So what we want to do is we want to go back to the create GUI function, and inside of here is where the chest is passed to this function and we create the GUI. What we want to do to make this as easy as possible for ourselves is we're actually going to use the clone, and we're going to set an attribute on the clone, and the clone refers to the brand new GUI that we're creating. Now the attribute that we want to set of this clone is going to be called currency, and the value of this attribute is actually going to be chest, and then we're going to call get attribute on the chest. And what attribute do we want to get from the chest? Well, we want to get the currency attribute from the chest so that we can set the currency attribute of the clone, just like that. Now that we've set that attribute, we can come back down to the update GUI function, and inside of this else right here, we can actually create a new variable called currency, and it's going to be equal to GUI get attribute, and then the attribute we want to get is called currency. So now that we have the currency, we can go ahead and use the gsub method on the unclaimed title, and we're going to replace the word currency with the actual currency that we just got right there. So now that we've actually modified the title text, we also want to modify the subtitle text as well. The subtitle text is a lot less work. All we have to do is set that to the unclaimed subtitle, just like that. Okay, so now that we've created the update GUI function, what we want to do is create that while loop that I was mentioning in the beginning, which we're going to use to constantly update all of the GUIs so that we can actively display the cooldown to the player. So below where we call the generate GUIs function, we're going to create a while loop, and we're going to say while true do. Then what we want to do is we want to actually loop through all the children inside of our GUI variable right here. So we're going to say for underscore comma child in GUI get children do. Then we want to say if the child dot name equals template, then continue end. So as we loop through the GUI, if one of the child is named template, we don't want to do anything with that specific child, so we're just going to continue through this loop. And then what we're going to do is call the update GUI function, and we're going to pass through the child.name, just like that. Finally, what we want to do on the last line of this while loop is say task.wait1. So we want to update all the GUIs every single second. Now, we're pretty much done with scripting the GUIs. What we then need to do is actually add communication between the server and the client. So we can go ahead and close out of our chest local script. What we then want to do is go inside of the replicated storage, and then we're going to add a brand new remote event. This remote event should be called update chest, just like that. And now that we've created this remote event, we actually need to make sure that we add that remote event to the player state manager on the client side. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside the client folder, open up the state module script, and inside of here is where we need to add the brand new remote event. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this right here. Instead of update island, we're going to say update chest. And what this function is actually going to accept is an island, which is a string, but it's actually then going to accept a cooldown, which is a number. Then inside of this function, function, we're going to say player data dot chests, index that with a specific island, and set that equal to the cooldown, just like that. So on the server side, we're actually going to be using this remote event to communicate from the server to the client to tell the player, hey, we just updated your cooldown, you've unlocked the chest, and everything like that. And this is going to update the player state on the client side. And based on how we created the update GUI function on the client in our local script, it'll constantly update every single second, and it'll use this data as well. So now that we scripted most of the stuff on the client, added the communication, we got to start scripting all the stuff that we need to do on the server side. So we're going to go ahead, close out of the state manager, and we can close the replicated storage and the starter player as well, and even the workspace. Then we're going to go inside of the server script service, add a brand new script to this, and we're going to rename that to chests as well, just like that. Then inside of here, we're going to need some of our standard variables. So we're going to say workspace. We'll also do this for the replicated storage as well, and we probably want to do this for the server script service as well. Now, of course, we need the remote variable. That's equal to replicated storage dot remotes, and we're going to need the player data manager. So local player data, and that's equal to require server script service dot player data dot manager, just like that. We're also going to need the island config module as well. So we're going to say local islands config equals require replicated storage .configs.islands, and there we go. We've got most of our variables. Now, the first function that we're going to create is going to be for listening to when a player touches a chest. So we're going to say local function create chest listener, and that's going to accept no arguments. Then, similar to what we did in our local script, what we're going to do is we're going to loop through the descendants of the islands folder. So we're going to say for underscore descendant in workspace.islands get descendants, just like that. Of course, if the descendant.name does not equal chest, then we're going to continue just like that. Next, what we can do is create a new variable, and this is going to be called touch part, and this is going to be equal to descendant.hitbox. And the reason that we're doing that is because remember, every single chest model has a part inside of it called hitbox, and we're going to be using that part to listen to any time a player actually touches that part to see if we want to reward the player with the specific chest. Now that we have that touch part, what we're then going to do is say touch part.touch connect, and then connect that to an anonymous function. Now inside of this anonymous function, it's going to accept other part, and of course we want to get the player. Now before we're actually able to get the player, we need to get the player service up here. So we're going to say players and players, just like that. Now we can then say local player equals players get player from character, and then we're going to pass through the other part dot parent, just like that. Now, if we do find that a player is touching this part, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to actually try to collect the chest for the player. So we need to create a function for that. So let's go above the function that we just created and create another local function, which is going to be called collect chest, and that's actually going to accept a player, which of course is a player, and it's going to accept the chest, which is a model, just like that. So now back to the create chest listener function. If the player is found, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to call that collect chest function, pass through the player, and pass through the descendant as well. And of course, the descendant is the chest model. So there we go. So now we're finished with creating this specific function. We want to make sure that we call that below where we created that so that this runs once the script starts. And now we can start working on the collect chest function that we created right here. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to actually create a variable outside of this function called debounce, and that's going to be equal to a blank table. Now, inside of this function, what we want to do is we want to check the debounce table, and we want to try to index that with the player. Now, if we are able to find the player inside of the debounce table, then we just actually want to return end and stop the function right there. So the way that we're actually using debounce is to basically give it a delay before the player is able to touch the part again. Next, what we want to do in the function is we want to actually get the player's profile. So we're going to say player data dot profiles, and of course index that with the specific player. If we don't find the profile, then we just want to return end, stop the function right there. Additionally, let's go ahead and create a variable for the specific island, and that's going to be equal to chest dot parent dot name. And then we want to check if the player actually has the island unlocked. If the player is hacking or exploiting in our game and they're teleporting to a chest trying to redeem it, but they don't have the island unlocked, then we obviously don't want to reward the player. So we're going to say local is island unlocked, and that's going to be equal to islands config dot is island unlocked. And with this method, we're going to pass through the profile dot data, and then of course the specific island that we want to check if it's unlocked as well. Now, if the island is not unlocked, then what do we want to do? We just want to return end and stop the function right there. Now, after we check if the player actually has the island unlocked, we would then want to check if the player has a cooldown for the specific chest. So we're going to say local player cooldown equals profile dot data dot chest, and then we're going to index that with the specific island, just like that. So then if the player does have a cooldown and the player's cooldown is greater than os.time, then we want to return end as well, because that means that this chest is currently on cooldown. Then below this, we can then actually create variables for all those different attributes that we set on each of the individual chests. So for instance, we have the cooldown variable that'll be equal to chest get attribute cooldown, just like that. And then we can basically copy and paste this 2 times, and now we're just going to change the attribute. So we will also want to get the currency attribute and the reward attribute as well, and then we can go ahead and rename those variables. So reward and currency, just like that. Now, if we make it down this far in the function, we actually want to start rewarding the player. So we're going to say if currency equals, and now we want to check if the currency equals clicks. And if it does equal clicks, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to actually use the player data manager, and then we want to use a function called adjust clicks, and this requires us to pass through the player, and then we're going to pass through reward, which is the amount of clicks that we actually want to reward to the player. Then we're going to say else if, and if the currency equals gems, then what do we want to do? Well, we're going to call another function from the player data module, and then again, we're going to pass through the player and the reward again, just like that. Then finally, one more else if statement, and this time, if the currency equals rebirths, then what do we want to do? Well, once again, player data dot adjust rebirths, pass through the player, pass through the reward, just like that, and there we go. So now we just scripted the actual rewarding the player for opening the chest inside of this function. What we then need to do is we actually need to apply the cooldown to the player as well. So the way that we're going to do that is by saying profile.data.chests and index that with the specific island. Then we're going to set that equal to os.time plus the cooldown. So now we're setting the cooldown for the player. And then since we set the cooldown, we need to make sure that we actually replicate to the client as well. So we're going to say update chest, fire client, and we're going to pass through the player. We'll also pass through the island, and then we need to pass through the cooldown as well. So we're just going to copy this variable that we just set to the cooldown and pass it through like that. And that's how we're going to communicate from the server to the client and tell them the cooldown of the chest that they just opened. Then let's not forget to set the debounce that we created above here. So we're going to say debounce, index that with the player, set that equal to true. Then we want to use task.delay and wait 0.5 seconds. And then what we want to do is we want to make sure that we set debounce, index that with the player, and we're going to set that to nil. So we're removing the player from that table so that this function can be called once again. Now that we've done all that, we've actually scripted everything and we can go ahead and start testing this out. So currently in the game, I'm on this specific island. Let's go ahead and start the game and see how this works. So upon loading in, I can see clicks chest ready to collect. Let's go ahead, walk over to here. And now we can see that we actually have been rewarded. It says come back in 0 hours, 9 minutes and 52 seconds. And the timer is constantly updating. And that means that this is working really nicely. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with that being said, that's going to be it for this episode. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure you smash the like button, also hit the subscribe button, and turn post notifications on so you get notified when I upload more Roblox development content. Additionally, we have Patreon. If you guys like to support me and gain access to all the scripts and the game file that I made during this episode, there's a link down below in the description, and you guys are going to check that out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode.